In the previous video, you saw that in the first prophecy, in verses 1 and 2, John prophesies the rise of an absolute monarchy, created by the Roman Caesar, who will give it its throne and its authority, which happened in history, when Caesar Constantine gave Pope Sylvester the papal throne, at the Lateran Palace. You saw in verse 3, John prophesies the coming of the adoration of the crucifixion, but states it is not the crucifixion of Christ, but of the head of the beast. And this happened in history when Pope Sylvester was presented wood from Jerusalem, which was allegedly from the cross of Christ, nearly 300 years earlier. And the ritual of the adoration of the crucifixion was instituted in Rome. In verse 4, you saw that John prophesied the people of the empire would grovel to the dragon and the beast, and refuse to stand up to them, in fear of reprisals. And you saw this was fulfilled to the year, in the Council of Antioch, which made it an act of sedition, to refuse to go along with the institutionalization of Nicolaitanism, which had gained control of the power centers of the Roman Empire. And you saw in verse 5 and 6, John prophesies the beast is given a mouth, and that it will preach blasphemy, that will have authority for 42 months, a time frame which began in 387 AD and ended in 1647 AD, and which identified John Chrysostom as the prophesied mouth of the beast, whose very name Chrysostom means the golden mouth. And he was in fact the mouth for the empire, serving as the key advocate for the adoption of Christmas and rejection of the blood and flesh of Christ in the Passover meal. In this video, we will complete the historical fulfillment of John's first prophecy in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. In the previous video, we introduced the fact that John prophesied what he termed as the coming of the mouth of the beast. And we showed that that very prophecy was fulfilled in John of Antioch, later called John Chrysostom, which means the golden mouthed. And we showed how his preaching was virulently anti-Semitic, to such a degree, it warped even his theology. John in chapter 13 of Revelation describes Chrysostom prophetically as simply a mouthpiece for the beast. The beast being a reference to the absolute monarchy of the Roman papacy. And that was not a prophetic understatement of John Chrysostom, the mouth. The website, Judaism in Rome, explains Chrysostom, and his homily on the celebration of Christmas, went so far as to claim that the Roman Caesar was actually inspired by God. The term, inspired, is a very strong term. It is the same term that is used concerning Scripture, and it means God breathed. Chrysostom did not simply say that God worked through Caesar, in terms of his sovereignty over the affairs of men. He taught that God actually inspired Caesar in the same way that God had inspired the Scriptures. Thus the actions of Caesar were in reality indistinguishable from the actions of God. And we have already mentioned how he literally publicly preached that it was a duty of every real Christian to openly hate Jews. And the following quotes illustrate the manner in which he argued that point. Quote, "If someone had killed your son, could you stand the sight of him, or the sound of his greeting? Wouldn't you try to get away from him, as if he were an evil demon? As if he were the devil himself? The Jews killed the son of your master, will you so dishonor him, as to respect and cultivate as murderers, the men who crucified him?" End quote. Here is the origin of the label, Christ killers, despite the fact the New Testament actually records it was the Roman Empire that convicted Christ for treason and had him executed. Quote, "I know that many people hold a high regard for the Jews, and consider their way of life worthy of respect, at the present time. This is why I am hurrying to pull up this fatal notion, by the roots. A place where a horse stands on display, is a whorehouse. What is more, the synagogue is not only a whorehouse, and a theater. It is also a den of thieves, and a haunt of wild, not the cave of a wild animal merely, but of unclean wild animals. The Jews have no conception of spiritual things, at all, but living for the lower nature, all agog for the here and now, no better disposed than pigs or goats. They live by the rule of debauchery, and inordinate gluttony. Only one thing they understand, to gorge themselves and to get drunk." End quote. Quote, "When animals have been fattened by having all they want to eat, they get stubborn and hard to manage. Another prophet intimates the same thing, when he says, Israel ran about madly, like a heifer stung by a gadfly, and still another calls her, an untrained calf. When animals are unfit for work, they are marked for slaughter, and this is the very thing which the Jews have experienced. By making themselves unfit for work, they have become ready for slaughter. This is why Christ said, Ask for my enemies, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me. End quote. And here is where the idea of physically exterminating Jews actually came from. These quotes are attributed to John Chrysostom, in the year 390 AD, and that is, not by accident, the same year we see in verse 7, on our historical timeline. And finally, the quote we shared in the previous video, where Chrysostom claims, it is the duty of all Christians to hate Jews, even if it is the family of Christ himself they are hating. And as now can easily be seen, what Chrysostom is referring to as Christian is actually Antichrist Nicolaitanism. Quote, the Jews sacrifice their children to Satan. They are worse than wild beasts. The synagogue is a brothel, a den of scoundrels, the temple of demons devoted to idolatrous cults, a criminal assembly of Jews, a place of meeting for the assassins of Christ. I hate the Jews because they violate the law. I hate the synagogue because it hates the law and the prophets. It is the duty of all Christians to hate the Jews. End quote. When John prophesied Chrysostom's preaching would be blasphemy against both the sacred name of God and the Kodesh in verse 6, John was warning his readers, the mouth of the beast was going to reverse the definitions of God and Satan, and he would do this for the Roman Empire. You can see how this literally happened in the preaching of John Chrysostom, in declaring the Roman Caesar inspired by God, and in contrast, the entire Jewish family of Christ and the apostles, fit for slaughter and genocide. The anti-Semitism and blasphemous theology preached by Chrysostom was not unique to Chrysostom. His populist preaching represented the spirit of the entire Nicolaitan movement throughout the empire. Thus why his preaching was so popular. He gave a populist voice, both to the dangerous nature of the beast, and the delusions of Nicolaitan theology, that was commonly held throughout the Nicolaitan world, in what we call today, Nicene Christianity. But, it is documented in history, that the Nicolaitan celibate bishops, both knew the Christianity of the New Testament community, and openly denounced, and condemned it, as a crime of heresy, against the Roman Empire. And following in the spirit of Chrysostom, incited the people of the Roman Empire against the genuine and original followers of Christ. The people actually responsible for authoring our New Testament literature, including the book of Revelation, we are now examining in detail. How do we know this to be a fact? In Acts, chapter 24, verse 5, it is recorded that they were referred to by the Jewish high priest as, quote, the sect of the Nazarenes. End quote. Meaning this label had been spread, and they had become known by this epitaph, so much so that it surfaced in Paul's legal proceedings, recorded in the book of Acts. One celibate Nicolaitan, who actually emerged from the very same community that produced the Gnostic Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, was called the Bishop of Salamis, in Cyprus. He wrote a book entitled The Panarion, between 374 to 377 AD, 10 years before Chrysostom began his famous public tirades against Jews in Antioch. In the following quotes, you will see that although Epiphanius acknowledges the historic continuity of the Jewish community to the first apostles and to Christ he is about to attack, he condemns them as heretics nonetheless, because their religion is Jewish and not Roman. And Epiphanius even refers to them by the very same name, cited in the New Testament, as applied to the genuine followers of Christ. Quote, this sect of Nazarenes is to be found in the Decapolis near Pella, for that was its place of origin, since all the disciples had settled in Pella after their remove from Jerusalem, Christ having told them to abandon Jerusalem and withdraw from it because of the siege it was about to undergo. And they settled in Perea for this reason and, as I said, lived their lives there. It was from this that the Nazarene sect had its origin. End quote. Panarion chapter 29. Paragraph 7.7-8. In this text, Epiphanius openly admits that as late as the 300s AD, these Nazarenes, who were the direct descendants of Christ and the first apostles, were still around, and still known by the same name as recorded in Acts chapter 24 verse 5, as the sect of the Nazarenes. But, watch why he condemns them as heretics. Quote, "They are Jews in every way, and nothing else. They do not only use the New Testament, but also the Old Testament, as the Jews do. For unlike the previous sectarians, they do not repudiate the law, the prophets, and the books which are called writings by the Jews and by themselves. They have no different views but confess everything in full accord with the doctrine of the law, unlike the Jews, except that they are supposedly believers in Christ. For they acknowledge both the resurrection of the dead and the divine creation of all things, and declare that God is one, and that His Son is Jesus Christ. They are perfectly versed in the Hebrew language. For among them the entire law, the prophets, and the so-called writings, I mean the poetic books, Kings, Chronicles, Esther and all the rest, are read in Hebrew, as of course they are among the Jews. They are different from Jews, and different from Christians, only in the following ways: they disagree with Jews because they have come to faith in Christ. But since they are still fettered by the law, circumcision, the Sabbath, and the rest, they are not in accord with Christians." End quote. Plenarian chapter 29. Paragraph 7.1-5. So in other words, since they followed Christ and the apostles in keeping Sabbath, and rejected the observation of Constantine's venerable Day of the Sun, they were heretics, because they were still Jews. Despite the fact that their theological tradition and customs could be traced directly to Christ Himself and the first apostles in the New Testament, and were even admitted to be such by Epiphanius, who was condemning their practices as heresy, instead of humbling himself to learn from them. That is why John prophesied this anti-Semitic, thus Antichrist, preaching would amount to blasphemy against God and the Old Testament Kodesh. The following quote comes from page 44 of the book, Decline and Fall of the Roman Church, by Malachi Martin, who is the professor of paleography at the Vatican's Pontifical Biblical Institute, and secretary to Cardinal B. during preparations for the Second Vatican Council. Quote, "The Jewish Christians had no place in such a church structure. They managed to survive until the first decades of the 5th century. Then one by one, they disappear. A few individuals reconcile themselves with the Roman Church, always as individuals, never communities or whole Jewish Christian churches. Another few pass into the anonymity of the New Eastern Rite, Syriac, Assyrian, Greek, Armenian. But most of them die by the sword. Roman garrisons hunted them as outlaws, and by starvation. They were deprived of their small farms. By the time that the first bibliography of Jesus, apart from the Gospels, is published in Chinese, and in China, at the beginning of the 7th century, there are no more surviving Jewish Christians. The despots have ceased to exist. Everywhere, the Roman Pope commands respect and exercises authority." End quote. Quote, "Most of them die by the sword. Roman garrisons hunted them as outlaws." End quote. As a result of the blasphemous preaching of Chrysostom, the entire blood family of Christ on the earth had been completely exterminated by the Roman sword before the 7th century. And Chrysostom's legacy of blasphemy and anti-Semitism would go on to inspire centuries of massacres, genocides, and even the rise of the Nazi Party and the ensuing Holocaust in World War II, Germany. After John's prophecy about the establishment of the throne of the Roman papacy in verses 1 and 2, and the adoration of the crucifixion of the beast in verse 3, and the Council of Antioch in verse 4, verses 5, 6, 7 and 8 are all about what comes as a result of the preaching of the mouth, which we know today to have been the coming of John Chrysostom. Verse 7 reads as follows, quote, "And it was given to him to fight against the holy and conquer them, and he was given authority over all descendants and languages and ethnicities." End quote. This text begins with a statement that the absolute monarchy John is calling the beast will both fight and conquer the holy, translated as the word saints, in the KJV. In Chapter 11, we cover the terminology translated into English as the word saints. Here in our direct translation from the Textus Receptus, we use the word holy, referring to the original Hebrew word, kodesh. As you just saw in the conclusion of verse 6, previously, in the quote concerning the extermination of the blood family of Christ, the Roman papacy did precisely that, exterminating every known Jewish believer in Christ, before the beginning of the 7th century. So that part of verse 7 was definitely historically fulfilled. The second part of verse 7 states that this absolute monarchy would claim authority over all descendants and language groups and ethnicities on the earth. Their claim to power would be absolute, not just in terms of the territory where they ruled, but over every people on earth, for all time, even those not even born yet. This is such an outlandish claim to power, there is no way on earth anyone could honestly possibly just miss it. And it is both so unique and bizarre. Among even absolute monarchies on earth, there is no honest way you could ever mistake it for anything else. Did this happen in history? The following are 3 papal encyclicals. They can all be found online at www.papalencyclicals.net. These encyclicals are made public by the Vatican. The Vatican website explains that the term encyclical is, quote, the name typically given to a letter, written by a pope, to a particular audience of bishops. End quote. It also explains that, quote, in modern times, usage has confined the term, almost exclusively to certain papal documents, which differ in their technical form, from the ordinary styles of either bulls or briefs. End quote. And that, quote, encyclicals are letters sent to all the bishops of Christendom. End quote. The Wikipedia article entitled, Encyclical, explains what a papal encyclical is. The article describes an official papal encyclical as, quote, generally used for significant issues and is second in importance only to the highest-ranking document now issued by popes, an apostolic constitution. End quote. The article goes on to state, quote, if the supreme pontiffs in their acts, after due consideration, express an opinion on a hitherto controversial matter, it is clear to all that this matter, according to the mind and will of the same pontiffs, cannot any longer be considered a question of free discussion among theologians. End quote. And add, quote, encyclicals indicate high papal priority for an issue at a given time. End quote. So in other words, encyclicals are statements written down by the papacy that are intended to be, for the record. They want these statements to be read and distributed both to their own clergy and to the public, as an accurately stated communication from the papal throne itself. These are not issues up for debate among theologians or Catholic apologists. If you reject these papal statements, you are rejecting the authority of the papacy itself, and are no longer Catholic at that point. You are distorting the way the Vatican itself wishes to explain its views, both to its own clergy, and additionally, the public. The first encyclical is entitled, the Superquibusdam. It was written by Pope Clement VI, in 1351 AD, to the Armenians, informing them that if they wished to be saved, they would have to submit to the rule of the Roman Pontiff. It reminds the Armenians, in the form of a rhetorical question, at the end of the text highlighted in yellow, that no one outside obedience to the Roman Pontiff will be saved. The second encyclical was written by Pope Pius V, in 1570 AD, and is entitled, Regnans in Excelsis. It states, quote, the Pope of Rome, to be by him governed in the fullness of power. Him alone, he has made ruler over all peoples and kingdoms, to pull up, destroy, scatter, disperse. End quote. Quote, he has made ruler over all peoples and kingdoms. End quote. And the third encyclical was written by Pope Boniface VIII, in 1302 AD, and is entitled, De Unum Sanctum. And it states, quote, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation, that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff. End quote. Repeat. Quote, it is absolutely necessary for salvation, that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff. End quote. Those statements are published by the Vatican itself as its own papal encyclicals. Those are not distortions, exaggerations, accusations, false quotes, or anti-Catholic drivel, as is often claimed by Counter-Reformation apologists. Those are statements published by the Vatican, which are intended to end debate. You can only admit to them, or lie about them. The real position of Roman Catholic theology, on the authority of the absolute monarchy of the papacy, has never really been confused by anyone, Catholic or Protestant, throughout history. The Roman Catholic saint, Catherine of Siena, stated quite plainly, quote, "Even if the Pope were Satan incarnate, we ought not to raise up our heads against him, but calmly lie down to rest on his bosom. He who rebels against our Father is condemned to death." End quote. And for this kind of blasphemous teaching, she was not rebuked, but canonized as a Roman saint. The absolute monarchy of the Roman papacy is above, and has authority over, all rulers and kings and kingdoms and laws on the entire earth. It has unconditional authority over all nations, all kingdoms, and all people, no matter who or where they are. In fact, every single human creature must submit to it, or be eternally damned. Meaning also, unfortunately, it is considered morally justified to also physically destroy them, if necessary, in service to this global monarchy. Which periodically, throughout many times in history, it has actually done. Roman Catholic apologists attempt to mock the publication of the fact that the Pope claims to be God over the earth. But the truth of the matter is, in the above quote by Saint Catherine of Siena, the Pope is exalted even above God. The position of God would be a demotion. It is abundantly clear, from the Vatican's own statements, anyone wishing to be honest about the past, can easily see, verse 7, was fulfilled in history, precisely as John had prophesied. There is nothing in the future to be waiting for, when it comes to events that fulfill the occurrence of this verse. But that's not all, concerning the historical fulfillment of this text. Although this text was certainly fulfilled in history, the date on our historical timeline points to an unmistakable correlation to one of history's greatest mysteries. In the year 380 AD, something known as the Edict of Thessalonica was issued. We have covered this event in more detail in previous videos on this channel. In the Edict of Thessalonica, the prophecy Paul gave the city of Thessalonica came to pass in an edict of papal authority over the city of Thessalonica. One of the rules in physics is that for every action, there is an equal but opposite reaction. Everything produces a reaction. In many ways, you can see this principle of physics play out in human history. There is never the assertion of authority over any people or region without generating at least some reaction against it, often resulting in strikes, protests, riots, sabotage, civil wars, and much of the drama we know as history. According to Rome, despite declaring that they would seize control of all religious activity in the city of Thessalonica, declaring anyone that disagreed with them madmen and outlaws against the state, there was no reaction whatsoever to this authoritarian edict. Despite the fact that the city of Thessalonica had been described as one of the most religious cities in the empire, and was in personal possession of Paul's prophecy that this very event was coming to their very city, and it would be the revelation of the man of sin and son of perdition, prophesied in 2 Thessalonians, chapter 2. Oh, except there was this very strange event 10 years later. It was one of the largest massacres in Western history, and it took place in this very city, in the very year of 390 AD. Roman garrisons rounded up 7,000 men, women and children, in the city's hippodrome, locked the gates, and then began to slaughter them all, one, by the sword, gutting their bowels, and chopping off their arms, legs, and heads. The butchering included both women and children, and went on for an entire 3 solid hours. Not a single person was left from the slaughter. And the oddest thing about that slaughter, in this very Christianized city, was that Rome claimed it had absolutely nothing to do with their edict at all. The Wikipedia article on this event, entitled Massacre of Thessalonica, notes the following. Quote, "Modern historians have had difficulty discerning the details of the massacre and its aftermath. There are no contemporaneous accounts of the event. Instead, the works of 5th century church historians provide the earliest record of what happened. Many parts of these accounts contradict one another, and some are of questionable reliability. The pagan historians of late antiquity do not discuss the massacre at all. Scholars contend that most accent records portray events by focusing on the moral perspective rather than the historical and political details. This makes it difficult for modern historians to distinguish fact from legend." End quote. According to Rome's accounts, authored the following century later, Emperor Theodosius just accidentally lost his temper, because these were rioters objecting to the arrest of a popular charioteer who had homosexually raped a young boy. And that made him so mad that he just lost it and accidentally slashed them all to pieces for 3 hours. Men, women and children. After just accidentally rounding them all up in the city's hippodrome. Secular historians have been justifiably skeptical of that claim, but because the protestors were all exterminated, there was no one left alive to ever contradict their version of events. So while historians openly state they are skeptical of that explanation, there is no testimony left in existence to contradict the account, except John's prophecy pointing at the year of 390 AD, and the prophecy that the dragon and the beast would become violent and conquer. It is highly possible that the massacre in the year 390 AD in the city of Thessalonica was the reaction of at least some segment of the people of the city against the papal power grab that was demanded in the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD. Church historians in the following century, who wrote about the event, invented an entirely fictional account of what happened, glamorizing the acts of Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, who was supposedly so shocked by the massacre, he refused the Emperor Theodosius communion until he publicly repented of what he had done. But, unfortunately, most historians today believe the story is fiction. It never happened. But what is obvious from the creation of all these cover story fictions is that something shockingly brutal did occur, and the only way to acknowledge it happened was in a fictionalized cover story about it. The truth is, everything Rome has told the world about this massacre has been a lie to hide what happened. It is no accident that these events coincided with John's prophecy in Revelation chapter 13 verse 7, and the date of 390 AD, wherein 7,000 men, women and children were mercilessly butchered in the city's hippodrome for 3 solid hours. And neither is it an accident that over the sky of the city of Thessalonica, in April of 390 AD, we see the signs in the heavens of the constellation Bootes and Corona Borealis rise to mid-sky. Bootes, if you remember, was the constellation that represented the chief god of Babylon, and he is represented holding the sickle in his hand, which some have connected to the sickle of the Grim Reaper. And so again, you see, verse 7 was very literally fulfilled in history. Verse 8 reads as follows, quote, "And they reverenced him, all those residing in the land, whose name was not written in the book of life of the Lamb, butchered or slaughtered, before the founding of this order." End quote. You may be seeing this verse for the first time, translated directly from the Textus Receptus. As was discussed in the previous videos, this verse is a contrast verse with verse 3. And the same exact word is used in both verses. But in church board translations, primarily because of theological evasion, the word is given a completely different meaning in verse 3 than it is here, even though it's the same exact word. In verse 3, they translate the word as the word wound, and here in verse 8, they translate the word as slain. Same exact word, only 5 verses later. And in doing that, they cloak John's intent to contrast the two crucifixions. The one that is adored in verse 3, which really worships the image or icon of the beast, and the real one here, that is not adored, but that occurred before the order of the beast was ever founded. In verse 8, John mentions also something he calls the Book of Life of the Lamb. So what is the Book of Life of the Lamb? Generally speaking, anyone who has spent any time growing up as a Christian is familiar with the term. It's not thought of as a literal book, but as a metaphorical record of those who have eternal life and are going to heaven. To be blotted out of the book of life means you are not going to heaven. That's the simple common understanding of the term. But the term has some interesting historical background, which is very relevant to John's use of the term here, and his use of it in the book of Revelation. The exact phrase, the Book of Life, is only used 8 times in the entire Bible. 7 of those 8 occurrences are found in the book of Revelation. John uses the term 7 times, once again, in keeping with his themes about the temple menorah and the Feast of Dedication. The most famous and common understanding of the term comes from his use of it in chapter 20, verse 15, where he states that whoever is not found in the book of life is cast into the lake of fire. So, according to John, it is a pretty serious thing not to be found written in the book of life. The only other time in the Bible the term is used is by the Apostle Paul in the Epistle to the Philippians, chapter 4, verse 3, where he mentions a fellow laborer by the name of Clement, along with others, and says they are in the book of life. It is by no coincidence this term is found nowhere else in the New Testament except by Paul, because Paul had been a Pharisee and a trained rabbi prior to his conversion. And the term was part of the Pharisees' traditional ritual involving the observance of Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur, which is the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement. This time of year is the holiest and most solemn time of the entire year in rabbinical Judaism. And thus we see Paul's use of the term. While it is not surprising to see Paul's use of the term, given his background, it is a little surprising to see John's repeated use of the term, and that he not only used it, but used it repeatedly, 7 times. John was obviously trying to remind his readers of something that connected them to their familiarity with it in Jewish custom and ritual and liturgy. But what was it? That is where the historical background of this term informs us of what John was trying to bring to everyone's attention. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia lists the standard concept understood by most Christians, that the Book of Life is, quote, in the New Testament, it is the record of the righteous who are to inherit eternal life, end quote. If you look up the term in Wikipedia, you will read the following quote. In Christianity and Judaism, the Book of Life is the book in which God records the names of every person who is destined for heaven or the world to come, end quote. The article goes on to say, however, that, quote, the Jewish liturgy and the tradition relating to the New Year and Atonement days adhered to the ancient view, which took the Book of Life in its natural meaning, referring from a practical point of view, end quote. And it explains the specific use of the term among the Pharisees. Quote, the Pharisaic school taught that on the first day of each year, Rosh Hashanah, God sits in judgment over his creatures, and has the books of life, together with the books containing the records of the righteous and the wicked, end quote. So why would John be bringing up this Jewish custom repeatedly 7 times in the book of Revelation? What was he doing? At the beginning of every Rosh Hashanah, preceding Yom Kippur, there is a Hebrew greeting that is commonly heard among Jews all over the world, still to this day. The greeting is, Lashana Tova. It is an abbreviated version of Lashana Tova, Tekot Evuve, Tekot Temu, and means, may you be inscribed and sealed in the book of life for a good year. Rosh Hashanah is known as Yom Teruah in the Bible, or the Feast of Trumpets. If you recall from previous videos, the trumpet judgments culminated in the complete utter destruction of the city of Antioch because of God's judgment on Nicolaitanism. John is bringing that issue up again in verse 8, and creating a contrast with the counterfeit Christianity of Nicolaitanism, in verse 3, which will adore a false crucifixion, which in reality is nothing more than the head of the beast. John states in verse 8, that the absolute monarchy, which he is calling the beast, which was created by the Roman Caesar, will be reverenced by all those who are not written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Meaning also, those who are reverencing this monarch will not be written in the Lamb's Book of Life. John is presenting 2 mutually exclusive positions. You cannot do both. You must choose one or the other. But you will not have both. To accept one means implicitly that you reject the other. To understand the precision and specificity of this prophecy, it is important to look a little deeper at the details of its language. When we translated this text from the Textus Receptus, we chose to use the English word reverence simply because there was a lot of denial and confusion and obfuscation over the English word worship. The term reverence includes the term worship, but the term worship does not include the term reverence, and since both are indicated by the Greek term, we chose the more inclusive term reverence. But the literal meaning of the actual specific Greek term is to kiss like a dog licking his master's hand. Its definition is really an entire sentence long, and is the specific picture of a dog licking its master's hand. In other words, it is a very specific description of a very specific thing. It is taken to mean metaphorically, reverence or worship. But the actual meaning of the term is to kiss like a dog licking its master's hand. Why is all that an important detail? Because when you look at history, to see if this was fulfilled, that is what you need to be looking for. So was this fulfilled in history? As you can see, the prophecy was fulfilled. This ritualized custom is known as kissing the Pope's ring. It was derived from the practice of kissing the ring of the Roman emperor and transferred to the papacy because the Roman Pope took the title of Pontifex Maximus. On the website of the Catholic News Agency, in an article entitled, "Why Do People Kiss the Pope's Ring?" Professor Roberto Rigoli, who teaches church history at Pontifical Gregorian University, explained although it was not ritualized as part of official papal ceremony until the 15th century, quote, "The custom of kissing the ring of the Pope has been a gesture of respect in the church for longer than can be remembered." End quote. Although the literal meaning of the Greek term, proskuneo, is to kiss like a dog licking his master's hand, one of the interpreted meanings of the term is to prostrate oneself. And they do that too. So there is very little ambiguity or confusion about this prophecy being fulfilled in emergence of the Roman papacy. So when you hear modern counter-Reformation rapture preachers, or their minions, telling you or suggesting to you an American president, or a Muslim, or a Jewish rabbi, or some modern atheist is the Antichrist, or has anything to do with Revelation chapter 13, they are literally ignoring the very language of the text in Revelation to make that claim. None of these alternate explanations have people kissing their hand, prostrating before them, ruling over absolute monarchies, nor were any of them created by the Roman Caesar. This very obvious fact means that the people promoting those alternate suggestions are either extremely ignorant or terribly dishonest. But those are the only two options really available. These texts are very clear about what John was prophesying. And it is very clear how they have come to pass in history. You have to literally ignore what you see with your very own two eyes to get to some other conclusion. And, unfortunately, John is making himself also very clear that those who venerate this absolute monarch created by the Roman Empire will not be written in the book of life. He contrasts the one who was the true crucifixion from the one that was created to replace him. To embrace one is to reject the other, and vice versa. That is simply the truth of the language of this text. The same truth the Counter-Reformation is willing to tell any kind of lie to hide. When we get to chapter 13, verses 9 and 10, we come to the end of John's first prophecy, of 2, in chapter 13. The second prophecy will expand the end of John's last 3 verses in the first prophecy, which are verses 8, 9 and 10. Much like how John takes the 7th seal, the 7th trumpet and the 7th saucer to open the next series of prophecies, John is using verse 8, 9 and 10, to open up the second prophecy, which actually covers the end of the same section of time frame that he is opening up with verses 8, 9, and 10. In the previous section, because the language of the prophecy was so important to understand, we intentionally did not address specific events on the historical timeline involving verse 8. But because verse 8, 9 and 10 refer to a progression or a chronology of historical events that occur on the timeline, in this section we will survey them all together. Verse 9 and 10 read as follows. Quote, "If anyone has ears, let them hear. If any captivity assemble, into captivity they will lead themselves. If any with the sword kill, with the sword he need be killed. In this is the endurance and the faith of the holy." End quote. Technically speaking, verses 9 and 10 are not a prophecy. They are a warning. The familiar expression, "If anyone has ears, let them hear," prefaces John's warning with a tone of seriousness, much like a parent might scold their child, prefacing their comment with the more familiar English expressions, "You had better listen up," or, "You had better pay attention here." Then John gives his warning by stating, "If you assemble with the captivity, it will lead you into captivity. If you fight against it with the sword, you will be killed with the sword." John warns his readers against 2 very natural responses. One is to compromise and join the assembly. The other is to take up the sword against it. John warns that neither response should be given. Both responses will have disastrous consequences. John advises his readers against compromise, but also against violence. And he ends his statement by saying, "In this is the endurance and faith of the holy." This is the official position of the true Christian. This is the position of the Apostle John himself. Neither compromise nor violence. The world will tell you that that belief is foolishness. Without violence, nothing will change. Without compromise, you will only hurt yourself. The world will advise that you should do both, compromise, and then use violence. And they will also claim while they compromise and use violence, that they are Christians. Groups which are totally compromised with the world, the Antichrist, and the devil, will claim they are Christian. And other groups, which are literally centered around violence itself, will also claim they are Christian too. But John says in the strongest language he can express himself, "If anyone has ears, let them hear." That will not be the truth. And that claim, itself, will be an eternally deadly lie. If you are either compromised with the beast, or if you are violent against it, in either case, you forfeit your name in the book of life. You are not in the faith of the holy. And that is as serious a warning as John can possibly give anyone. He is condemning both extremes. There will be a time and a place when the beast is brought to an end, by God alone, and by his own hand. Until then, do not just sell out and compromise, but also, do not embrace violence. that is the endurance and faith of the holy. It is the hardest of all places to walk, but it is the path of the genuine Christian. And to be very clear, not compromising does not mean never cooperating. John was in prison and in exile, but he was still cooperating. And not taking up the sword does not mean never resisting. You can resist without violence. And you can refuse to compromise and still cooperate. As long as the cooperation does not compromise, it is still maintaining integrity. And as long as the resistance is not violent, it is still seeking peace. But John draws the lines on both sides of the road for the Christian. Compromise and violence are where you must stop as a genuine follower of Christ. Verses 8, 9 and 10 give us the years 415, 418 and 469 on our historical timeline. So these three verses are spanning a section of historical events from 415 to 469 AD as a crucial time in the emergence of this absolute monarchy. Events on the historical timeline involve dominance of the beast and civilization, and the issues of both violence and compromise, for people witnessing its ascent. So what were these events? And how did they relate to John's prophecies? In verse 8, John prophesies that those who live in the land behind the beast will proskuneo him, which means to kiss on the hand, or to prostrate themselves before him. Then in verse 9 and 10, we get John's warning. The year on our historical timeline begins in the year 415. This was a sequence of events that began around 380 AD with the Edict of Thessalonica, which we have already covered extensively. It granted the papacy in Rome the full legal authority of the Roman Empire. The only other city mentioned outside of Rome in the Edict of Thessalonica was the city of Alexandria, Egypt. In the year 415 AD, events would occur in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, which would impact the course of civilization and remain controversial up into our very own day, over a millennia and a half later. The following information comes from a study on the history of these events entitled Religious and Intercommunal Violence in Alexandria in the 4th and 5th centuries CE by Lauren Catlow, professor of classical studies at Concordia University. On page 11, under the section entitled Conflicts with the Jews and the Death of Hypatia in 415, Professor Catlow explains that these events occurred in the 3rd year of St. Cyril's appointment as Bishop of Alexandria, and that Cyril evidenced serious anti-Semitic views in his letters, collected by Robert Wilkin, that included such descriptions as the Jews were demented, God-haters, Christ-killers, and their synagogue as a house of leprosy filled with monstrous impiety. Professor Catlow goes on to state, quote, "At the time, Orestes was the prefect of Egypt. He was friendly with Alexandria's large and established Jewish population. Importantly, he was also friendly with Hypatia, who according to John of Nicaea had beguiled him through her magic." The accounts of the events, if not the motivations, are fairly consistent between John of Nicaea and Socrates. On Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath, the Jews were accustomed to watch the dancing displays and create great crowds, according to Socrates. Orestes published an edict controlling these shows, a move unpopular with the Jews. At this assembly to receive the edict was a Nicene Christian named Hierax. John of Nicaea portrays him as virtuous and blameless, and also implies that he was present at the meeting at Cyril's behest. Socrates, however, states that Hierax applauded upon hearing of the edict, an act deliberately offensive and provocative. In any case, the Jews objected to his presence and actions, and Orestes, to placate them, had him publicly and corporally punished. Cyril perceived this to be a political action, according to John of Nicaea, and approached the Jewish leaders with threats. The Jews, in response, conceived of a plan. They identified themselves by rings made of palm branches, and, in the middle of the night, sent up the alarm that a prominent church, the Church of Athanasius, was on fire. As the Christians exited their houses to save their church, they were slaughtered by the Jews. The following morning, the Christians rallied, and drove the Jews out of Alexandria and pillaged their houses and synagogues. The relations between Orestes and Cyril were henceforth undoubtedly antagonistic. John ties the present incursion of the monks in with the conflicts with the Jews. He states that the death of Ammonius, as elaborated below, was another reason Cyril was angry with Orestes, and therefore threatened the Jews, while Socrates places it temporally, after the expulsion of the Jews. It is unclear as to whether or not they arrived at Cyril's direct behest, but it is clear that they were violently opposed to Orestes. They accused him of being a Hellene, and one, named Ammonius, threw a rock which hit Orestes' forehead, and caused him to bleed profusely. The population of Alexandria rose to the defense of their prefect, and secured Ammonius. Orestes later had him tortured and put to death, although the second unnamed monk that John says was murdered along with him, is not mentioned in Socrates' Historia. Cyril, in another overt political act to undermine Orestes, had Ammonius declared a martyr and renamed the Massacre, and buried in a church. Moreover, he eulogized Ammonius himself. Socrates points out that even the Christians thought that Ammonius had been out of line, indicating that not all of the Alexandrian Christians supported their bishop wholeheartedly against their prefect. He opines that Cyril's own sense of being in the wrong led him to not press the issue. The culmination of these tensions came under the leadership of a man named Peter, a magistrate, according to John of Nicaea, and an unofficial leader, according to Socrates. Socrates dates it for us, quite precisely, in the month of March during Lent, in the 4th year of Cyril's episcopate, under the 10th consulate of Honorius, and the 6th of Theodosius. This translates to March, sometime after the 3rd, 415 CE. He gathered a mob of Christians, a multitude of believers in God according to John of Nicaea, a group hurried away by a fierce and bigoted zeal according to Socrates, and a crowd of bestial men, truly abominable according to Damascus. This mob went to Hypatia's house, and subjected her to physical torture, cutting out her eyes as she lived, stripping off her clothes and dragging her to her death, or murdering her with tiles and subsequently burning her body. While Damascus agrees with Socrates and John of Nicaea on the events, he does not include the narration of the conflict with the Jews or the monks of Nitria, and his digression on Hypatia. He relates the murder directly to Cyril, who is jealous of Hypatia, whether for political power or just because of his inferiority is unclear. While neither Socrates, nor John of Nicaea, directly relates Cyril to Hypatia's murder, it seems clear that both place this event within the context of the ill will between Orestes and Cyril. John of Nicaea even goes further, and says that the Christians of the city, after the death of Hypatia, proclaimed Cyril the new Theophilus and congratulated him. End quote. As these events were unfolding in the city of Alexandria, mentioned in the Edict of Thessalonica, on the exact date of March 3, 415 AD, as cited by Professor Kaplow, over the sky of Alexandria, the sign of Spica, the ear, was overhead in the sky, and the planet Jupiter, a line directly above Spica, was positioned precisely and exactly next to the ear of Virgo. The murder of Hypatia and the pillage and expulsion of Jews from Alexandria are not debated events in terms of their occurrence. The third event was so embarrassing, however, it has come to be a matter of denial in Roman Catholic and Counter-Reformation sources. That was the destruction of the Serapeum, over which Hypatia was curator. The Serapeum was a temple to Serapis, but like most ancient temples, it served civic purpose as well in the city of Alexandria. It was an annexed depository to the Great Library of Alexandria. Today, if you research the topic on the internet, you will discover most sources will pretend what happened to the Library of Alexandria is a great mystery. Some will flat out state it was burned by Julius Caesar and leave it at that, or only provide a sentence or two of its history afterwards. Others will repeat the claim it is a mystery, and then list the 3 explanations known from the past. The first of these 3 explanations is that Julius Caesar substantially destroyed the library in his invasion, and what remained of it after that was only a myth or a legend. That is currently the most popular explanation. The problem with that explanation, however, is that not only was the library still in existence, it is documented that Mark Antony famously gave Cleopatra a gift, in the form of a donation of 200,000 scrolls to it, after this alleged destruction. So it clearly still existed. So the claim it was ended by Julius Caesar is patently a false narrative. The second explanation is that the library was destroyed as part of Cyril's attack on paganism in the city of Alexandria during these very events. This is the explanation that was the standard history of Western civilization until our current modern revisionist New World Order history decided that was too embarrassing and needed to be rewritten for no good reason other than embarrassment. This was the explanation documented in Edward Gibbon's History, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is out of hand rejected, because well, Gibbons must have been secretly an atheist, or a deist, or something. As though that charge would change the facts of history. The third explanation was a medieval explanation that was created for propaganda purposes, centuries later, by a single monk, who claimed an invading Muslim named Omar burned its manuscripts as fuel for his bathhouses, because he wanted nothing from it, contradicting the Quran. But no one really believes that explanation is really credible. Even those who are spreading it today. Thus the regression back to Julius Caesar as the most popular explanation. The only problem with that explanation, however, is that it is actually fictitious. The historical fact is simply the same today as it has always been. Gibbons did not write that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed during this time, because he secretly wanted to malign Christianity. He wrote that is what happened, because that is what happened. People who do not want to acknowledge their history, invent excuses to avoid it. And their current explanations of the Library of Alexandria are a prime example of that avoidance. Prior to the current New World Order historical revisionism, secular historians saw in the events of the year 415 AD, culminating with the death of Hypatia and the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, and the pillage and expulsion of Jews, as the beginning of the descent of the Dark Ages in Western Europe in the form of the Papal Empire. In the year 418, in the West, forced conversion of Jews began on the island of Minorca off the coast of Spain, and by the year 469 AD, something known as the Ipahan Holocaust occurred in the East. A critical event cited in these retaliations was the role the Jewish community had tragically played in taking up the sword against Cyril in the city of Alexandria, precisely as John had warned against in his prophecy in verses 8, 9 and 10. And that brings us to the end of the historical fulfillment of the first prophecy. And as you can see, John's prophecies were fulfilled in history, precisely as he had prophesied. In this video, you have seen that John's prophecy in verses 5 and 6, concerning the mouth of the beast, was fulfilled in the coming of John Chrysostom, whose name literally means, the golden mouth. You saw that verse 7 was fulfilled in the claim to absolute authority over all nations, laws and peoples by the Roman papacy, and that people who are standing around waiting for this prophecy to be fulfilled in the future, have to ignore its clear fulfillment in the past, to do so. You saw in verse 8, John's prophecy that the people of the land behind the beast will, proskuneo, him, was also literally fulfilled in the Roman papacy, in history. And in order to get to a future fulfillment of this prophecy, you once again have to intentionally ignore its fulfillment in the past. And you saw that John's warning in verses 9 and 10 perfectly coincided with the violence in Alexandria, which not only resulted in the murder of Hypatia and the pillage and expulsion of the Jews from Alexandria, but possibly the destruction of the last remnants of the Library of Alexandria, and the commencement of the Dark Ages in history. And that these events concluded John's first prophecy in verses 1 through 10. In the next video, we will begin examining John's second prophecy in chapter 13. This prophecy will cover some of the most famous references to the events surrounding the fire from heaven, 666 and the famous mark of the beast. In the next section of videos, you will also discover to what lengths these subjects have been intentionally hidden from the public, as we once again look directly into the details of the Greek text from the Textus Receptus, which served as the original source text for the King James Version and many other New Testament translations. Thank you for watching.